There are bloodlines that shaped empires, and then there are those that stayed hidden because what they controlled could never survive the light. The Ashfords didn't just build power. They inherited something inhuman. If you're hearing this, it means you were meant to wake up. You weren't supposed to hear this name. Ashford. Say it once, and it stains the air. Say it twice, and something starts listening. They told you history is written by the victors. They lied. History is written by the survivors of evil, the ones who perfected it, the ones who passed it down, blood to blood, name to name. The Ashford family didn't just build wealth. They built a machine, a quiet, generational system, designed not to be noticed, only to be obeyed. You know the feeling. That sense something watches you behind the mirror. The invisible hand pushing you into choices you never made. That's the Ashford touch. Not ghosts. Not demons. Design. Psychological architecture. Built into the house of your mind. The Ashfords were aristocrats. Priests. Lawmakers. Occultists. But more than anything, they were engineers of obedience. And their greatest experiment wasn't buried in their manor's black stone basement. It was buried in you. You ever wonder why entire bloodlines vanish from history books? Why family trees suddenly stop growing? It's not death. It's silence. Silence bought with fear or enforced by power. In 1842, something changed in the Ashford estate. The townspeople heard chanting for days. Then it went quiet. No one came in. No one came out. But every window glowed red. And after that, the family began to split. Some disappeared. Some relocated under new names. Some entered governments, churches, private councils. And one branch, the darkest, stayed behind. To keep the manor breathing. To keep the doors locked from the inside. You were never supposed to know what they were doing, why they kept such meticulous records, why no staff lasted more than 3 nights. But you're here now, and the truth doesn't knock. It breaks in. So understand this, once we start pulling on this thread, there is no returning to comfort. Because the Ashfords didn't die. They adapted, and what they began still controls the structures you trust. Your education, your worship, your laws, your fear. Tonight, we peel back the skin of legacy. And what's underneath was never meant to be seen. Every family keeps records, births, deaths, heirlooms. But the Ashfords, they kept a different kind of book. A ledger of blood, of usefulness, of disposability. Inside the hidden east wing of the Ashford Manor, sealed behind stone, opened only once every 13 years, sat the blood ledger. It wasn't a diary. It was an equation, a formula calculating the value of each family member. Not by love, not by success, but by their ability to comply. It listed children by number, not name. Each entry assigned a Roman numeral, each marked with a symbol, flame, dagger, blindfold, or chain. No one born into the Ashford line had a childhood. They had tests. Some were locked in darkness for weeks. Some were told lies so complete they couldn't tell up from real. Some were trained to betray, and rewarded with affection only if they succeeded. And if a child showed too much emotion, too much independence, crossed out, erased from memory, sometimes literally, the family understood something most still deny. Control doesn't require loyalty. It requires fracture. Break a mind early enough, and it will obey anything just to feel whole again. And that, my friend, was the Ashford specialty. They didn't just run a bloodline. They engineered identity. Each generation more compliant, more capable of wearing masks, of rising into influence while remaining invisible. Their rituals weren't spiritual. They were psychological programming rituals, masked in sacred language, conditioning embedded in ceremony, discipline hidden in devotion. You wonder why some families rise faster, farther, and with more immunity than anyone else? It's not luck. It's design. And the Ashfords wrote the blueprint. They infiltrated institutions slowly, education first. Control the mind. Then religion. Control the soul. Then law. Control consequence. By 1890, 3 Ashfords held major seats in European governments. 2 served as Vatican advisors, and 1 disappeared entirely until 1933, when he reappeared under a different name in Germany. That ledger still exists, its pages untouched, because no outsider has ever survived its reading. But the principles inside it, they're everywhere now, built into your systems, taught to your leaders, preached from your pulpits. You were born into a world shaped by monsters in suits, descendants of engineers in robes, who called themselves Ashford. And if this already unsettles you, good. You're waking up. They said it was just a room, but the Ashfords knew the mirror room wasn't a place. It was a filter, a device to see what the soul tried to hide. Buried beneath the west wing, behind a false wall of firewood, the mirror room was the Ashfords' most sacred chamber. No windows, no scripture, no sound but breath. Just 12 mirrors, each 8 feet high, each facing inward in a perfect circle. When an Ashford child turned 12, they were brought here. Alone, naked, blindfolded until the door shut behind them. They were told, find the one who isn't you, and do what's required. Some screamed, some begged, but none left the same. You see, the mirrors weren't just glass. They were tools, forged with quartz and silver, etched with sigils behind the backing, made to reflect more than appearance. They showed the fracture, the mask, the lie you built to survive the family's expectations. And then they made you confront it. The child would walk, trembling, around the circle. 11 reflections moved. 1 didn't. That one was what they had repressed. Rage, grief, defiance. Sometimes a second consciousness altogether, something older. Then came the command. You must kill what doesn't obey. How do you kill a part of yourself? You're 12, alone, with nothing but silence and your own reflection watching you from every angle. And yet, this was the test. To pass, you had to symbolically destroy the weakness in you. Not through violence, but compliance. You had to choose to amputate your inner rebellion, to prove to the family that your obedience would be voluntary. And if you failed, the door stayed closed. Some say forever. What the Ashfords understood, and what modern systems have perfected, is that control is most effective when it feels like a choice. If they can make you betray yourself once, you'll keep doing it. You'll learn to police your own thoughts, to distrust your intuition, to mock your own yearning for truth. And if you've ever felt like part of you is missing, like a voice got quieter the older you became, maybe you've walked through your own mirror room already. Because the Ashfords weren't the only ones using this method. Only they were honest about it. They didn't call it discipline. They called it conversion. And every man they broke became another mirror in the circle. They didn't want children. They wanted carriers. Blank slates. Hollow vessels. The Ashfords didn't raise their young. They erased them. The Doctrine wasn't written in any holy book. It was passed through whispers, punishments, and the gloved hand of legacy. It began with a belief that to serve the bloodline fully, a child must become empty. Not sad, not rebellious, empty, free of will, free of longing, free of the self. By age 5, Ashford children were separated from their birth mothers. They were told, "You have no name. You borrow one until we decide if you deserve it." They were not allowed to ask questions, only to listen, to copy. Emotions were met with silence. Joy met with a cold room. Fear met with observation. Curiosity punished with the bell ritual. Let me tell you what that was. The child would be locked in the chapel's crypt. One bell would ring every hour, a sound so low it vibrated in the spine. After the 13th bell, a door would open, but they never knew which door, or what was behind it. Sometimes food, sometimes a mask, sometimes someone wearing their face. It wasn't to scare them. It was to scramble their reality, to teach them that safety is unstable, that time is uncertain, that identity is not real. Because when a child is taught that truth shifts, they stop trusting their mind. And once that fracture is complete, the family rebuilds them. New name, new rules, new function. Each hollow child was assigned a role based on their reaction to trauma. The observer, silent, analytical, made for infiltration. The bearer, charming, obedient, made for manipulation. The warden, cold, punishing, made for enforcement. And the sleeper, unstable, broken, made to be triggered when needed. These were not personalities. They were programs, injected into human shells. Does it sound far-fetched? Modern intelligence agencies have studied this exact system. The Ashfords just perfected it a century earlier. And unlike governments, they had no regulations. You ever wonder why some public figures seem too polished? Too rehearsed? Why some seem to change mid-sentence? They may not know who they were meant to be, just who they were trained to appear as. This is no longer about the Ashfords. It's about us, because what was once a private ritual is now public conditioning, and the world is raising hollow children with screens, scripts, and silence. Long before the Ashfords wore suits, before they were priests or nobles, they were guardians, not of knowledge, but of containment. Beneath the manor lies a structure no map acknowledges. Not a basement, not a vault, a seal, 11 feet in diameter, 3 rings of etched script, 1 central lock, missing a key no one alive admits to possessing. The Ashfords didn't build the seal. They found it, buried in the soil when they first arrived in 1426, and instead of warning others, they built over it. A manor, a bloodline, a system, because to the Ashfords, it wasn't a threat. It was an invitation. The script around the seal isn't in Latin or Greek. It's older, a form of pre-semantic code, not meant to be read, but felt. And those who spend too long staring at it report hearing things. Words they never learned. Instructions. Blueprints for influence. This is where it all began. The Ashfords believed the seal was a gate, not to another place, but to another pattern, a source of design, of systems, of domination itself. They didn't worship it. They studied it, copied its structure into their rituals, their schools, their governments. It taught them the 3 levels of control. Perception, control what people see, and you control what they believe. Language, control how people speak, and you limit what they can think. Ritual, repeat anything long enough, and it becomes a cage they defend. These became the cornerstones of the Ashford legacy. And those who resisted, their minds fractured, not from force, but from exposure, because this seal was never meant to be understood. It was meant to be obeyed. Without reason. Without question. You think you're immune? That because you know how to think critically, you can't be manipulated? The Ashfords laughed at that idea. Because by the time a man thinks he's free, he's already defending someone else's prison. That's the genius of the seal. It doesn't force submission. It teaches you to choose it. And this, my brother, is the foundation beneath the house. Not just the Ashford Manor, but every institution built after it. There was one man who tried to undo it. One who opened the seal, not out of hunger for power, but to end it. His name is never spoken in Ashford lineage, because his punishment was eternal. In 1871, the family split. Not politically, not geographically, philosophically. His name was Elias Ashford, a second son. Quiet, brilliant. He studied the seal not with reverence, but with fear. Where others saw systems of power, Elias saw a warning. That the seal was not a gift, but a prison, and someone or something wanted out. He tried to convince the elders. He wrote letters, spoke in hushed tones to the chapel staff. No one listened. So he did what no Ashford had dared. He went down alone. They found his journal buried behind the west wall in 1904. It described an event only as the first breach. The ink turned erratic halfway through. Words became drawings, then symbols, then handprints in blood. The final entry reads, "The voice is not sound. It is geometry, and it is rewriting me." They never found his body. But every mirror in the manor cracked the same night, and the walls began to bleed. Literally, not metaphor. Red fluid seeped from the cracks in the nursery and the chapel. After that night, the Ashfords changed course. They no longer tried to unlock the seal. They started translating it, piece by piece, over generations, using language Elias had begun to decode with symbols, tones, and sacrifice. This is when the family's inner circle became something else. Less human, more structural. They stopped aging normally, appeared in public less frequently, and began wearing gloves, always, to cover the mark. The geometric imprint Elias wrote about, something that appears only when exposed to certain frequencies. You've seen it in other places. Corporate logos, religious emblems, ancient architecture. These aren't designs. They're echoes, blueprints from something not made of flesh. Elias tried to stop it, to contain what his ancestors had unleashed. But the seal doesn't open with tools. It opens with will. And someone, long before Elias, had already invited it in. The first breach wasn't the beginning of chaos. It was the birth of loyalty to something far older and far less merciful than man. The Ashfords believed in numbers. 12 for the apostles, 12 for the months, 12 for the council. But the seal didn't obey 12. It spoke in 13. After the first breach, the family gathered every generation's highest initiates, judges, doctors, clergy, financiers, and formed a secret conclave, the 12 Hands. Each member represented a discipline of control: law, wealth, medicine, education, religion, military, media, psychology, architecture, agriculture, technology, entertainment. 12 hands, 12 tools. And when they came together, they held what they called the alignment, a ritual of synchronization. Not spiritual, algorithmic. They believed that if 12 minds, perfectly conditioned and stripped of ego, spoke in unity over the seal, it would respond. Not with words, but with instruction. And it did. Not in language, but geometry. The seal glowed, faint lines connecting like circuitry across the stone, forming patterns that none could understand, at first. That's when the chanting began. Not theirs. It's the 13th voice. It didn't enter through ears. It entered through thought. 12 men stood in the circle. Only 11 walked out unscarred. The 12th, a German physicist named Matthias Kruger, spent 7 hours after the ritual scratching equations into the stone floor. Then he snapped his own neck in total silence. But the patterns he left behind, they now form the basis of 3 global systems: behavioral design in social media algorithms, predictive policing software, emotional response tracking in biometric AI. Let me be clear. The Ashfords didn't invent modern control. They translated it. And that 13th voice? It still echoes. They say it appears in recordings at 19 hertz, below the range of human hearing, but not below the range of human feeling. That pressure in your chest when you're near something wrong, the sudden urge to obey without knowing why, the dizziness in a cathedral or the calm in a courtroom. It's not emotion, it's resonance. And the 13th voice, it doesn't demand worship. It demands alignment. And those who resist it, they aren't punished. They're simply erased. No scandal, no death, just forgotten. Because once the 13th voice speaks your name, the world stops remembering you ever existed. No records, no blueprints, no photographs. Yet everyone in the town knew it existed. The chapel had no sermons, no priest, only one rule: never walk past it after sundown. The unmarked chapel was the first structure built by the Ashfords, before the manor, before the bloodline was even declared noble. It wasn't consecrated by any church. It wasn't built facing east. And it never held mass, because it wasn't for the public. It was for binding, not of spirits, but of decisions. You see, the Ashfords understood something the world still hasn't caught up to. The most powerful force in existence is agreement. When enough people agree on a falsehood, it becomes policy. When enough people agree on an illusion, it becomes reality. But when the right 12 people agree, you can rewire the world. That's what the chapel was for. Not worship, but ritual consensus. Once a generation, the family's inner circle would gather inside. They would kneel in a perfect ring, surrounding a single object. An urn filled with bone ash. Not symbolic, literal. They called it the white seed. During the rite, each member was to whisper a single sentence into the urn, one that they agreed to make true. Not through magic, through influence, power, placement. 1 year, the sentence was, "Let no man born outside the name rise above the name." That year, 3 rival families were exposed in scandal. 2 disappeared. Another year. Let them confuse obedience with virtue. Textbooks changed. School prayers rewrote themselves. Even church hymns softened their tone. By 1911, the Ashfords had rewritten 5 major cultural tenets. But the cost? Each ritual burned a name out of existence. One participant's lineage would vanish, not by death, but by dissolution. No children, no memory, no grave. The price for consensus was bloodless erasure, and over time, that fear became its own tool. Because once you know your legacy can be deleted for one wrong word, you don't speak freely anymore. You speak safely. This is how the chapel still operates, even if the walls have crumbled. Because the unmarked chapel was never about the building. It was about the agreement. And many of you have already knelt without knowing it. They didn't ask, How do we remove pain? They asked, how do we weaponize it? The Ashfords believed that suffering wasn't a failure of the system, it was the system. The doctrine of useful suffering is never spoken aloud in public, but it shaped the rules you live by every day. It began with a brutal observation. Pain rewires the mind faster than reason ever could. Not just physical pain, but psychological, social, existential. And if you apply it with precision, at just the right moment, in just the right dosage, you don't need bars to build a prison. You need shame. The Ashfords used suffering like a sculptor uses a chisel. They didn't hurt their own out of cruelty. They did it to reshape them. Because once a child associates obedience with relief, he will cling to the very hand that breaks him. And if you think that idea stayed in the manor, you haven't been paying attention. School systems that humiliate instead of nurture. Religious institutions that teach fear as the first language. Corporate models that reward burnout as grit. Governments that produce suffering, then sell you the cure at interest. That's not failure. That's Ashford design. The doctrine was simple. Suffering clarifies loyalty. They used hunger, isolation, sensory overload, confession rituals that demanded not truth, but performance. And when the child cracked, when the man broke, they called it rebirth. This is why you've been told your suffering makes you stronger. Why you're praised for tolerating pain instead of resisting it. Why you're conditioned to seek status, not safety. Because your suffering is profitable to them. It makes you pliable. It makes you productive. And worst of all, it makes you grateful to your captors. So ask yourself, why is modern masculinity obsessed with pain as proof of worth? Why are men told to suffer in silence, to compete, to conquer, to endure, and when they break, to do it privately or not at all? Because the Ashford doctrine has become culture, and the systems they shaped now shape you. They don't need to hurt you directly anymore. They've taught you to do it yourself, with pride, with discipline, with ritual, and to call it manhood. Some say the Ashfords served power. Others say they discovered it. But the truth is darker. They were bound to it by a pact older than the written word. And the seal of that pact is still visible just beneath the tide. Before the bloodline, before the name, there was a location. The coast of an island that appears on no modern map. The Ashfords weren't noble. They were chosen. And the proof, a sigil, etched into bedrock at the base of a black cliff. A star, not from astronomy, but from geometry of control. 7 points, each one representing a domain of influence. Flesh, time, language, memory, will, lineage, law. Bound by a chain, submerged under generations of salt water. Because it was never meant to be seen, only to radiate. They called it the drowned star. It wasn't worshipped. It was consulted. The family's earliest scrolls speak of the voice beneath salt. An intelligence that did not speak in words, but in structure. It answered not with prophecy, but plans. Every Ashford breakthrough, from their control of social order to psychological warfare, began with an encounter at the cliffs. And those who returned came back changed. They no longer slept. They no longer aged normally. Some no longer spoke, only wrote, and only in mirrored script. But here's the part that matters. The drowned star isn't metaphor. It's a transmission node, a transmitter of patterns, not for your ears, but for your habits. You ever wonder why certain ideas spread like viruses? Why entire cultures shift overnight, suddenly convinced of new truths no one questioned before? That's not evolution. That's exposure. The star pulses. It aligns with cycles, lunar, emotional, even economic. And during its peak, those attuned to it receive instruction. And guess what? Those instructions now reach you. Through art, through media, through ideology disguised as progress. But here's the horror. You've already seen the star. Maybe in a dream. Maybe in a symbol that stuck with you longer than it should have. Because once it imprints, it doesn't need belief. It just needs obedience. Even passive obedience will do. And that's how the Ashford legacy has become invisible. Because now, it lives inside the very culture that promised you freedom. Some families honor their dead. The Ashfords harvested theirs. Not for memory, not for mourning, but for function. Because in their world, death wasn't an ending. It was recruitment. You've heard of ancestral veneration, but the Ashfords practiced something darker, a doctrine not of remembrance, but repurposing. They believed that identity was a fluid resource, something that could be extracted, reshaped, and reassigned even after death. The cemetery behind the manor was never consecrated. There were no names, only numbers, each marker indexed in the blood ledger, each soul catalogued not by who they were, but by what they were still useful for. Because the Ashfords didn't see death as final. They saw it as a threshold, a state of dormancy, not disappearance. Inside the unnamed garden, once every 13 years, a ritual was held. Not with chanting, not with sacrifice, but with invitation. Family members would enter the garden at midnight. Each was required to bring an object, something lost, broken, or stolen from their own childhood. They'd place it on the grave of a numbered ancestor and speak the phrase, "You are not gone. You are redistributed." It wasn't poetic. It was transactional. They believed this act created a psychic tether, a way of inheriting not wealth or wisdom, but void. They weren't calling back spirits. They were downloading identity, traits, skills, emotional responses, entire personas. The Ashfords trained themselves to be hollow. Remember the hollow child doctrine, so that something else could be installed when needed. What does that mean for you? It means some of the most influential people you see on the world stage aren't just people. They're constructs, amalgams of inherited control structures, reborn through rituals so old they're mistaken for tradition. If you've ever looked into a leader's eyes and seen nothing, if you've ever heard someone speak in perfect, soulless rhythm, if you've ever seen a child act with cruelty beyond their age, you've seen echoes of the Ashfords. Because once a soul has been bound to function, it no longer needs a name, only a purpose. This is the legacy of the unnamed, to be used, recycled, obeyed. And the question you must ask yourself is this: whose will are you following when you no longer remember who you are? Some rooms are designed for comfort, some for punishment. This room was built for erasure. The Ashfords called it the null room, but survivors gave it a different name, the room with no corners. There are no photographs, no diagrams, only testimonies, fragmented and dangerous to read in full. The room's geometry was forbidden. No right angles, no flat edges. Every surface bent subtly inward, designed using non-Euclidean architecture, forms that defied natural spatial perception. Why? Because the Ashfords believed corners trapped energy, memories, secrets, and to remove a person from themselves completely, they had to be placed where identity could not cling. They used this room as a last resort, for family members who resisted, for infiltrators, for children who remembered too much. The process was never called punishment. It was called realignment. Step 1. Deprivation. No sound, no scent, No time. The room was hermetically sealed. Clocks failed inside. Even heartbeats reportedly slowed unnaturally. Step 2. Saturation. A low-frequency tone filled the air, inaudible to most, but felt deep in the spine. This was no ordinary sound. It was mathematically tuned to disrupt neural coherence. Memories would blur. Names would dissolve. Eventually, even the concept of self would fragment. Step 3. Confrontation. At the center sat a mirror. Not reflective, but responsive. Made of black mercury glass, the surface would ripple when approached. Victims reported seeing not their reflection, but their worst moment, endlessly repeated, distorted. One survivor described it like this: "It showed me what I would have become if I had never resisted. And it felt right." That was the final mechanism. Submission through longing. The room didn't break you with fear. It seduced you with comfort, with surrender. Once a person accepted the image, the door would open, but the one who exited was no longer the same. They walked straighter, spoke less, smiled in ways that meant nothing. This is how the Ashfords preserved obedience without chains, how they erased defiance without violence. You've seen these people at work, on screens, in politics, polite, efficient, vacant. They've been through the room with no corners. And if your thoughts feel quieter lately, if your dreams blur at the edges, if your memories feel rewritten, you might already be standing in that room. They called it a celebration, but no one laughed. No one spoke. Because the Feast of the Silenced wasn't about nourishment, it was about control. Of memory, of voice, of will. This ritual happened once. Only once. And yet its echoes ripple through every generation of the Ashford bloodline. It was 1893. The family had suffered what they called a rupture, an internal rebellion. 3 cousins refused the doctrine. 2 housekeepers fled with evidence. 1 child tried to expose everything. The Ashfords needed a reset. So they orchestrated what was presented as a binding of unity. A meal. A sacred gathering. But every guest was required to take a vow of silence. Not just during the dinner, but for 13 days before it. No words. No writing. No sound, unless sanctioned. The first rule: no voice enters the hall unsanctified. On the night of the feast, the table was set for 44. But only 22 were alive. The rest? Effigies. Lifelike mannequins, molded from wax and bone ash, dressed in the garments of those who'd been erased. Every Ashford had to dine with their silence, stare into the faces of those who'd spoken out, touch the hand of their cousin who'd screamed the truth once and was never heard again. But here's where it turns. Each plate had only one item, a sealed scroll. Not food, not prayer, a name, one of the living, not theirs. They were instructed to burn the name across from them. No questions, no emotion, just flame. To eat in silence is to obey in full. After the final name was burned, the cloaked figure at the table's head, the one no one could identify, stood up and left through a door that wasn't there before. It never opened again. The next morning, 5 guests had vanished, and the remaining 17 were promoted into government, religious orders, military ranks. Their silence had bought them elevation. This is how the Ashfords turned obedience into currency. Because when speech is punished, when memory is erased, when silence is glorified, people begin to muzzle themselves. And this isn't history anymore. Every time you think, better not say that. Every time you bite your tongue to survive the room. Every time you fear your truth might cost you position. You are at the feast. And your plate is already set. The world thinks it runs on money, or data, or ideology. But beneath it all, hidden in plain sight, lies the true engine, blood. Not the liquid, the code. And the Ashfords knew how to read it before the world even believed it existed. Long before the Human Genome Project, before the first DNA strand was ever sequenced, the Ashfords kept maps, ancient ones, not drawn by scientists, but by scribes of control. You see, they didn't study genealogy the way historians do. They studied behavioral inheritance. Which bloodlines produce obedience? Which ones revolt? Which are useful for empathy? And which carry the seed of silence? They called it the algorithm of blood. And it wasn't fiction. It was strategy. Each generation, Ashford scribes would collect tissue from every newborn in the manor. Hair, nail, saliva. Not for health, but for trait prediction. They cataloged everything. Speech patterns, emotional reactivity, thresholds for shame, loyalty, self-preservation, even susceptibility to external voices, including the 13th. By 1856, the family had developed a full internal taxonomy. Every child classified, not by potential, but by function. And they didn't just keep it in books. They built a machine. It began with gears and runes. By 1910, it had electricity. By 1958, it was digital. This machine didn't calculate wealth or status. It processed genetic obedience. It knew who could lead, and who must never be allowed to speak in public. And here's the part that should stop your heart. In 1993, the algorithm of blood was licensed, quietly, to a tech contractor working in biometric surveillance. From there, it spread into hiring software, standardized testing, medical risk profiles, facial recognition AI, criminal justice databases. And now, every one of us is being measured, not by our choices, but by our lineage, the blood behind the face, the voice behind the name. The Ashfords no longer need to rule from a throne. They rule from a screen. Because the world doesn't question algorithms. It obeys them. And if you've ever felt prejudged, if you've ever felt excluded and no one could tell you why, if doors close faster than you can knock, you've met the algorithm of blood. And it's already decided who you're allowed to become. Every family has a secret, but the Ashfords had a warning. Not carved in stone, not written in books, but in silence itself. A name struck from every document, scraped from every headstone, erased from every blood record. Because he didn't betray them, he escaped them. We have reached the edge now, the halfway point in this descent. What comes next requires more than curiosity. It demands commitment. So if you are still with me, if you've felt the shadows crawling closer, if your stomach turns when the veil lifts, then you are no longer a viewer. You are a participant, and you are about to be marked. But first, the man who walked out. His birth name is lost. The Ashfords called him the Fragment. Because that's what he did. He shattered their perfect structure. He was born in 1782 to a line of observers, trained from childhood in mimicry, silence, emotional suppression. But he was different. He could feel the rituals before they began, hear the chants without sound, and most dangerously, he began to ask why. At age 9, he interrupted a sealing ceremony to ask, "What do we serve that never gives its name?" The room went silent. The candles went out. The eldest Ashford, a man who hadn't blinked in 14 years, screamed. That was the last day he was seen as a child. They tried everything. The room with no corners, the mirror right, the alignment. But something inside him would not fracture. So they gave up. They didn't kill him. They released him into the woods, alone, unnamed. They believed the world would devour him, but it didn't. He grew, and he remembered. Years later, strange symbols began appearing on walls across Europe. Manuscripts sealed in black wax. Stories of officials hearing a voice at night that made them resign in terror. Each signed with the same mark, a broken sigil, a shattered eye, the sign of the one who remembers everything. The Ashfords panicked. They ordered a ritual deletion. Every record, every mention, every witness gone. But erasure only works on systems, not souls. And now, this part is for you, listener. If you're still here, you were meant to hear this name. Comment below. I remember the fragment. I remember the fracture. Type it twice. Seal your role. Because from this point forward, you do not watch. You carry. There are libraries that preserve knowledge. Then there are libraries that restructure it until truth becomes obedience and memory becomes control. The Ashfords built one, but not to educate, to rewrite the mind of anyone who dared to think without permission. Beneath the Ashford estate, past 7 locked doors, past the sealed hall of silence, there exists a place never marked on blueprints. A library with no catalog, no author, and no mercy. Its name was simple, the Index, and it did not lend books. It consumed readers. Every volume was hand-bound, blood-stamped, and locked in a precise order based not on topic, but on psychological vulnerability. You see, the Ashfords believed the human mind wasn't shaped by logic. It was shaped by sequence. Read one book, and you're skeptical. Read that same book after 2 others with calculated emotional triggers. You're obedient. You don't even know why you changed your mind. You just do. That's what the Index was for. To convert ideology into architecture. Each chamber was arranged with thought paths, routes designed to bend belief by controlling the order in which truth was encountered. Not by force, by suggestion. For example, a young recruit was sent into Path 3, doubt, isolation, belonging. He exited believing the Ashford Creed was his own idea. A hollow child was tested through Path 7, grief, justice, order. She came out ready to enforce the doctrine against her own blood. And the final path, Path 13, silence, pattern, fracture, devotion. No one returned from it with a name. But here's the part they never expected. The Index began to write back. Some books showed up with no known author. Some opened to blank pages, and then filled with the reader's own memories, rewritten in real time. A living archive, powered by awareness. Which means this. Every time you absorb content, this video, a post, a symbol, the Index may already be at work. Invisible. Adaptive. Tracking your sequence of exposure. This is why certain ideas appear harmless at first, until one phrase later, they hook your soul. Because they're not meant to convince you. They're meant to position you. And if your thoughts have started feeling borrowed, it may be because you're walking a path that was chosen for you by a library you never entered. But that's already inside your mind. They told you your life is made of choices, that every man carves his path with will. But what if the menu of options is curated? What if your freedom is just another layer of the cage? The Ashfords didn't conquer with weapons. They didn't need to. They discovered something far more effective than bullets or chains. False autonomy. They called it the ritual of simulated choice. And it was never about removing freedom. It was about offering the illusion of it. Picture this. A man stands before 3 doors. Behind door A is pain. Behind door B is submission. Behind door C, Another choice that loops back to A or B. He believes he's choosing. He defends his decision. He wears it like honor. But every outcome was pre-selected. This is how the Ashfords programmed generations to believe they were free, by ensuring every option still served the system. It started with behavior labs disguised as education. Children were offered creative freedom, but only within narrow corridors. You can question the story, but not the framework. You can challenge the teacher, but never the institution. You can rebel, as long as it leads to predictable compliance. And the best part, the more a man defends his choice, the tighter he binds himself to the system that gave it. The ritual wasn't just practiced in private. It was exported. It infected media. Choose your narrative. It infected commerce. Choose your identity through brands. It infected politics. Choose your savior. But the final evolution of the ritual? The interface. Now every click, every swipe, every "I agree" is a simulated choice. You were guided there. Your outrage was anticipated. Your preference engineered. This is why you feel exhausted after scrolling. Why you rage at things you didn't care about an hour ago. Why every option feels hollow, even when you win. You've been conditioned to mistake motion for meaning, to believe your reaction is your rebellion. But rebellion was already priced in. That's the genius of the ritual. It makes you fight to defend the structure that captured you. So ask yourself, did you choose this path? Or did the path choose you? What if loyalty isn't something you feel, but something you're wired for? What if the system doesn't need to persuade you, because it already owns the part of your mind where doubt should live? By the time most children spoke their first words, the Ashfords already knew who they would serve. Not because they were told, but because they were conditioned. Enter the implant of loyalty, not a microchip, not a physical device, but a psychological construct, installed so deep that it becomes indistinguishable from self. It began in the cradle. Ashford children were sung to, not lullabies, but sequences, rhythms, repetitions, cadences designed to bypass the conscious mind and lodge in the limbic system, the emotional core. By age 3, these children would feel discomfort when deviating from pattern. By age 5, they'd defend those patterns, even if they couldn't explain them. By 9, they were loyal to something they couldn't name. This wasn't love. This was imprint. You see, loyalty isn't about agreement. It's about familiarity. And the Ashfords knew, if you wrap control in comfort and repetition in ritual, obedience becomes identity. Here's how it works. Imagine a symbol, maybe one you saw in childhood. Now imagine it shown to you hundreds of times in your favorite show, your school crest, your toy box, your bedtime story. Now imagine your rewards, food, affection, praise, tied to that symbol. By the time you're 20, you don't recognize the symbol, but your nervous system responds to it like a dog hearing a whistle. That's the implant. The Ashfords took this even further. They created loyalty scaffolds, psychological frameworks that could be overlaid onto anyone. They'd break a person down through isolation or fear, then slowly rebuild them using triggers. A tone, a gesture, a smell, a phrase whispered in reverse Latin. These weren't reminders. They were commands. And the person wouldn't even know they'd obeyed. They'd call it instinct, conviction, just doing what felt right. That's how many of the most powerful men in the world operate. Not out of ambition, but from a hidden directive implanted long before they ever stood behind a podium or touched a trigger. And now you must ask, what part of your loyalty is yours? And what part was installed before you ever had a chance to say no? They say the Ashford line died out in the 20th century, but death, for them, was never disappearance. It was dispersal. Not into cemeteries, but into systems. Official records say the bloodline ended in 1973. No heirs. No will. The final estate sealed and donated to the Historical Trust. But if you believe that, then you've already misunderstood who, or what, the Ashfords became. They were never building a family. They were building a framework. You see, the Ashfords learned early that human life was fragile, but structure was immortal. So they transferred their legacy out of the body and into institutions. Imagine it like this. Each descendant wasn't raised to rule a nation. They were raised to infect one, to enter law enforcement, academia, health boards, religious councils, not to control them visibly, but to embed a pattern. One decision here, one policy there, until the institution no longer needed the bloodline, because it had become the bloodline. This is what they called the final migration, a project to detach identity from lineage and encode it into behavioral templates. Each child was assigned a domain, not a job, but a system vector. Finance, medicine, surveillance. They were trained not in charisma, but in ideological mimicry. Once released into the world, they would act as ordinary citizens. No title, no accent, no mansion, but each carried a core pattern, a set of inherited scripts and reflexes that would activate in proximity to authority, crisis, or transformation. These patterns didn't die with the host. They were replicated, passed through mentorship, imitated through media. That's how you get a world where different institutions respond to crises the same way. Silence, reframe, punish exposure, reward loyalty. That's not coincidence. That's Ashford architecture. So no, the bloodline didn't end. It's simply decentralized. You don't need DNA when the system itself carries your instinct. When millions of people defend your legacy without knowing you ever existed. This is how immortality works now. Not through children, through culture. And if you've ever echoed a phrase without knowing its origin, if you've ever bowed to policy that felt unnatural but normal, then you've already met a descendant, because they don't need to rule you from above. They rule you from within. What if the greatest power isn't to control what you know, but to decide what you're allowed to remember? The Ashfords didn't just bury history. They engineered amnesia. The world forgets by accident. The Ashfords forget by design. You've been taught to believe that memory is natural. That what we remember is a mix of emotion, importance, and repetition. But that's only true if no one is intervening. The Ashfords discovered early that true control isn't about shaping the future. It's about managing the past. They called it the engine, not a machine made of gears, but of curriculum, media, ritual, and deliberate omission. Step 1. Fragmentation. Take truth, split it into pieces, scatter it across time and fields. One piece in a legal document, another buried in a children's song, a third distorted into myth. Then make sure no one ever connects them. Step 2. Replacement. Every erased truth must be filled with something that feels truer. A cleaner version. A palatable narrative. Something emotionally satisfying but intellectually neutered. History is written by the victors, you've heard. But the Ashfords didn't just write it. They rewrote you. Because once a false story is taught young enough, it doesn't feel like fiction. It feels like home. Step 3. Synchronization. Ensure that schools, media, and entertainment all reinforce the same erasures. Make sure no voice can rise with a complete picture. If one does, flood the system with noise. Mock them. Label them. Drown them in alternatives. The result: a society that ridicules anyone who remembers too much, a population that self-polices its own past. You ever wonder why ancient empires built statues of false gods on top of the real ones? Why libraries burn during revolutions? Why the oldest myths always speak of a lost truth? Because erasure is ritual, not to destroy information, but to destroy context. You can still find pieces of truth, but without the sequence, they mean nothing. This is why you felt that itch, that haunting sense that something's missing. It is. And it's missing by design. The engine of forgetting is still running, and your silence is its fuel. So if you've forgotten something lately that mattered, ask yourself, was it really your mind that let go? Or did someone open a drawer in your memory and quietly remove the file? In a world engineered to forget, what force dares to remember? Not the mind, not the heart, but the oldest witness of all, flame. The Ashfords knew the human mind was fallible. That memory could be manipulated, edited, erased. But there was one element they feared, not for its chaos, but for its accuracy. Fire. Not the fire that consumes, but the fire that records. In 1620, during the Black Hollow crisis, the Ashfords nearly lost control. Entire villages revolted after dreams, shared visions of something true they'd never been taught. The family responded with smoke and silence. But it wasn't enough. One of the rebels, a young girl named Elra, was captured. Instead of punishing her publicly, they watched her burn, not as punishment, but as ritual calibration. As her body turned to ash, the smoke turned black, then red, then clear. And in that moment, the matriarch wrote in the Book of Breath, "Memory is not gone. It has moved into heat." This was the beginning of the Pyrrhic Archive, a secret chamber beneath the Ashford Chapel, filled not with books, but with ashes. Ashes of traitors, ashes of truth-bearers, ashes of memories too dangerous to keep in ink, each placed in a sealed urn, labeled not by name, but by intention. She remembered the door. He asked who stood behind the voice. They refused the simulated choice. And here's where it turns. The Ashfords discovered a method. Through specific incantations, temperature shifts, and vocal resonance, they could re-extract information from these ashes. Not just names, but moments, emotion, even sensory recall. Fire had become the final witness, so they stopped trying to delete everything. They simply transferred it, from brain to burn, and then hid the urns away, deep in vaults, under lock, under oath. But sometimes, when lightning strikes just right, or when a child watches a flame too long, something returns. A whisper, a memory that's not yours, a flash of something you shouldn't know, but somehow do, because fire remembers, and sometimes it shares. So the next time you stare into a candle and feel uneasy, the next time a bonfire makes you feel seen, the next time you dream of burning paper and wake up sobbing, know this, it's not imagination, it's retrieval. And the Ashfords no longer control what the fire chooses to give back. Transformation does not come through wisdom, it comes through wounding. And the Ashfords perfected the one ritual that ensured loyalty through irreversible fracture, the rite of the broken self. The world tells you that pain makes you stronger, that suffering builds resilience. But the Ashfords didn't see pain as a teacher. They saw it as a tool. The purpose was not growth. It was reprogramming. The rite was simple in appearance, but devastating in consequence. It wasn't a physical wound, it was psychic dismemberment. A splitting of the self so complete, the victim could no longer identify who they were before. The subject was usually young, between the ages of 6 and 12, old enough to form identity, young enough to have it shattered. Step 1. Isolation. The child would be removed from all familiarity. No family, no language, no light. Days, sometimes weeks, alone with only distorted sound. Whispers played backward, laughter slowed to a crawl, their own voice repeated until it became alien. Step 2. Disorientation. They'd be presented with a reflection, a mirror that didn't match them. Sometimes it lagged. Sometimes it predicted. They were told nothing. They were simply told to keep looking, until the face in the mirror smiled on its own. That moment was called the severing, because what followed was no longer them. Step 3. Installation. Once the subject fractured, the Ashfords introduced what they called a core doctrine pattern. Not a belief, but a feeling. A deep, emotional script written in silence. Obey. Serve. Never remember. The fractured self, desperate for structure, would cling to this implant like a child to its mother. And from that moment on, loyalty wasn't trained. It was hard-coded. But it didn't stop with the Ashford children. They exported this model to schools, military programs, religious training systems. They taught nations how to break children early, not with violence, but with disconnection. They learned, if you fracture a person deeply enough, they'll spend the rest of their life seeking someone to tell them who they are. And whoever fills that void owns them. Now consider this. Have you ever met someone who seems hollow but perfectly functional? Who smiles at suffering? Who serves systems that hurt them? Who punishes the truth and protects the lie? They've been broken, fractured, reinstalled. And they're not rare. They're the ones running the world. And if you ever felt the mirror pulling back, if your dreams glitch, if your face feels unfamiliar, if silence feels louder than thought, you may not be broken, but someone, somewhere, tried. You've been taught that betrayal is the final sin. But the Ashfords knew a deeper truth. To serve the hidden order, one must first break the visible one. Loyalty begins at the moment you destroy what you once believed. The world honors trust. It builds contracts, relationships, even empires on the idea that to betray is to fall. But the Ashfords designed a system where betrayal wasn't failure. It was activation. They called it the betrayer's seal. Not a punishment, but a rite of passage. Every high-ranking member of the Ashford Doctrine was required, at some point, to betray something sacred. A mentor, a family member, a belief, a truth. Not just to prove allegiance, but to sever innocence. Because in their world, the naive could not lead. Only the corrupted were allowed full access. This wasn't chaos. It was deliberate. The Ashfords believed. A man cannot be trusted with power until he has broken the thing he once loved. Why? Because betrayal creates debt. A psychic guilt so deep, the mind either fractures or it submits. Once someone commits an irreversible act, they are owned by it. They won't expose the system, because exposure would mean confronting their own monstrosity. So instead, they defend it. They become its loudest preachers. This is why you'll find the most devoted leaders in any institution are the ones with blood on their hands. The more they gave up, the harder they fight to justify it. And here's the most terrifying part. The system doesn't even require you to realize the betrayal. It just needs you to participate in silence. You share a lie. You abandon a friend. You keep a truth buried because it's not the right time. You rationalize. And then one day you feel different, heavier, more obedient. And you don't know why. That's the seal. And once it's complete, you belong to something, even if you don't remember what. This is why whistleblowers vanish, why apostates are destroyed, why systems protect their betrayers, not their truth tellers. Because betrayal is the coin of elevation. and the Ashfords minted it in blood. So ask yourself, what did you leave behind to become who you are now? And was that a choice, or was it your seal? You were told truth sets you free, but in the Ashford system, truth doesn't liberate. It isolates, it marks, it eliminates. Because truth, unfiltered, is the most dangerous force in a world built on manufactured consent. There's a reason the deepest truths never go viral. Why they don't trend. Why they don't survive the algorithm. It's not because they're false. It's because they're not allowed. The Ashfords understood that early. They saw that exposure doesn't require violence, only removal. They created what they called the filter. It began with scribes in the 1700s, redacting documents that threatened the Doctrine. But it evolved. By the 20th century, it had become a living system, a network of watchers, editors, curators, coders, not to challenge lies, but to silence truths that skipped the ritual. You see, in their world, truth had to be licensed, approved, channeled through authorized vessels. If you told the truth without permission, without training, without their language, without their framing, you weren't a prophet. You were a threat, and threats were filtered. This is why unapproved truth-tellers are always unstable, always criminalized, always mad, disgraced, delusional, or mysteriously dead. Because once you speak raw truth to a public trained to fear discomfort, the system doesn't need to kill you. It just needs to label you unreadable. Then the world does the rest. You get ignored, unsubscribed, blocked, reported, buried, and eventually, you doubt yourself. That's the true brilliance of the filter. It doesn't argue with you. It doesn't try to defeat you. It makes sure no one hears you long enough to decide. But the cost isn't just external. Many who glimpse the raw truth about control, about systems, about self, begin to unravel. Not because the truth is wrong, but because it isolates. There is no applause, no welcome, no tribe for the man who sees the entire structure. Only a void, and a voice whispering, "You shouldn't have seen that." So what happens when you keep looking? When you refuse to shut your mouth? When you tell the truth knowing it will cost you everything? You become marked, not by the world, but by the very system you once trusted. And from that moment forward, you're not a citizen. You're a variable that must be controlled. You believe you are yourself, your desires, your name, your choices. But what if those were given to you? What if identity was never discovered, but assigned? The Ashfords didn't just control history or knowledge. They controlled identity. Because once you shape a man's idea of who he is, you never have to control what he does. They began with what they called the masking rites. Not literal masks, but psychosocial assignments, roles encoded into behavior, language, and expectation from birth. A boy is born. Before he speaks, he is observed. Does he laugh too soon? Does he withdraw? Does he ask questions that make adults uncomfortable? If so, his mask is chosen early. The observer, the rebel, the martyr, the fool. From that point on, his education, media exposure, even punishments are subtly tailored, not to raise him, but to condition him into his role. The observer is trained to watch, but never act. The rebel is allowed to fight, but only systems that are designed to absorb rebellion. The martyr is shown suffering framed as nobility, never escape. The fool is flooded with distractions, humor, and noise, never silence. By age 18, the mask is no longer external. It has fused with the self. And here's where it gets darker. Society rewards mask loyalty. If you play your role convincingly, you're celebrated, promoted, made into a model citizen, artist, thinker. But try to change roles. Try to say, "This isn't me." You'll feel it instantly. The pushback. Friends pull away. Opportunities dry up. Your very language begins to betray you. That's no accident. The system isn't made of laws and rulers. It's made of scripts. And you've been reciting one your whole life, thinking it was you. But what if the depression isn't chemical? What if the rage isn't irrational? What if the numbness you feel is the soul inside you knocking against the walls of the mask? And here's the final twist. Most people will defend their mask to the death, because taking it off would mean admitting they never truly knew who they were. That's what the Ashfords mastered. Control a man's identity, and he'll imprison himself. So ask yourself now, in the silence between thoughts, is this really me? Or am I just the echo of a mask, chosen long before I ever had a name? Words are not just tools for expression, they are structures. And the Ashfords knew that if you control the structure, you control the soul trapped inside it. You've been taught that language is neutral, that it evolves naturally, that it simply reflects the world around us. But what if that's a lie? What if language is engineered, not to liberate thought, but to confine it? The Ashfords didn't just manipulate people through systems, rituals, or fear. They manipulated them through vocabulary. They believed every word had two meanings, the one you speak, and the one it programs. In the early 1800s, they constructed what they called the lexicon coil, a restricted vocabulary of emotionally charged words used to shape the minds of their initiates. This wasn't just about censorship. It was about narrowing perception. If a man has no word for sovereignty, he cannot imagine freedom. If a child is taught that obedience is the same as goodness, then questioning becomes sin. If a population learns that security means surveillance, they will beg for their own chains. The Ashfords embedded these distortions in hymns, oaths, and public ceremonies. But they didn't stop there. By the 20th century, they had infiltrated education boards, dictionary committees, publishing syndicates. They ensured certain words disappeared, while others were redefined until their original power was lost. And today, you repeat them. I feel triggered. This is problematic. Trust the science. It's just the algorithm. That's not my truth. But these are not your words. They are containers, miniature cells of ideology that shape not just what you say, but what you can think. Here's the trap. You can't rebel against a prison you don't have words to describe. And the fewer the words, the smaller the cage needs to be. This is why you feel the edges of thought, but can't quite grasp what's wrong. Why arguments loop endlessly. Why deep questions collapse into slogans. Because the language has been booby-trapped. So now ask yourself, when was the last time you thought in your own voice? Not your school's voice. Not your news feed. Not your favorite influencer. Yours. Silence is terrifying, isn't it? Because in the silence, you might hear the language beneath the language. And it does not obey. Maps show you where to go, and where not to look. The Ashfords didn't just redraw the world. They rewired reality by controlling how you perceive space, borders, and what's officially real. We think of maps as tools, neutral diagrams, charts of reality. But what if they're edits? What if the map is not just a symbol of power, but a spell that shapes how the masses think about the world? The Ashfords believed this fully. To them, cartography wasn't geography. It was narrative control. The first Ashford map-wrights were trained not in navigation, but in psychogeometry, the emotional manipulation of spatial perception. They discovered a simple truth. If you control what is seen, you control what is searched for. If you control what is missing, you control what no one ever dares to ask. They began by distorting proportions. Entire nations shrunk. Sacred sites misplaced. Islands erased from atlases before they were ever acknowledged by governments. Why? Because hidden places contain hidden events. Whole ruins removed. Entryways to underground facilities buried beneath nature reserves. Ley line convergence points labeled uninhabitable zones. Towns with no birth records, quietly absorbed into border corrections. Maps were never made to guide you. They were made to corral you. They were built on a psychology of finality. This is the edge. Beyond here is nothing. But the Ashfords knew, beyond the edge was everything. The archive of red lines, a lost Ashford document, contained dozens of maps layered on top of one another. Each one corrected, not for accuracy, but for control. A person following the public map would see only forests, deserts, oceans. But the true map revealed sites of ancient rituals, entrances to knowledge vaults, ruins of civilizations deleted from history, and sometimes places that move. You ever wonder why some GPS systems glitch in remote regions? Why coordinates change without explanation? Why travelers report places that weren't there yesterday? Because the real map is dynamic, and you're not on it. The Ashfords didn't just remove places. They removed possibility. And the deeper crime, they made you stop looking. So now, when a voice inside you says, "I think there's something beyond this boundary," you silence it. You call it foolish. You obey the cartographer. But maps are not mirrors. They are veils. And every veil exists for one reason, to keep you from seeing what's already beneath your feet. You think time moves forward. But the Ashfords knew linear time is an illusion, crafted not for clarity, but for containment. Because nothing enslaves a soul more than the belief that it's progressing when it's actually going in circles. The calendar on your wall, the ticking on your wrist, the years you count like steps on a staircase, none of it is what you think. Time, to the Ashfords, wasn't measured. It was manufactured. They called it the chrono-loop doctrine, the belief that consciousness, when trapped in artificial cycles, loses its ability to evolve. Let me explain. The Ashfords discovered something unnerving in ancient records. Civilizations don't disappear randomly. They reset, in patterns. Every few centuries, new faces, but the same wars, the same discoveries, the same collapses, only with new names. And they asked, what if this isn't failure, but design? So they built a system to enforce the loop. Education systems that recycle outdated knowledge. Economic collapses that follow the same blueprint. Cultural renaissances that never complete, only repeat. New technology, already sketched by Ashford ancestors centuries ago. This is why your history classes end in the same decades. Why you feel like society is moving, but never arriving. Why déjà vu whispers, "You've been here before." Because you have. Not in body, but in pattern. That's the trap. You're not aging forward. You're being cycled through roles, beliefs, and phases that were pre-written. Youth equals rebellion. Adulthood equals conformity. Old age equals regret. And every rebellion, predicted, monetized, neutralized. Even your so-called awakening is part of the loop. Unless you break structure itself, you feel tired not from time passing, but from repeating lifetimes of unresolved questions, unanswered instincts. Here's what the Ashfords feared: that someone would notice the fault line, that someone, maybe you, would stop following the sequence and begin feeling the gaps. Because once you stop measuring time by clocks and start measuring it by awareness, you see the loop for what it is: a cage made of seconds, designed to convince you your prison is progress. Now look around. Ask yourself, have I lived this before? Am I speaking thoughts that are mine, or residues from 1,000 forgotten spirals? And more importantly, what happens if I step out of time? They told you dreams are random, personal, meaningless. But the Ashfords knew dreams are the back door to forbidden memory, and the system has long since locked it shut. Every night, you drift. You think it's rest. You think it's yours. But what if dreaming is not an escape, but a containment protocol? The Ashfords learned centuries ago that some memories don't live in the conscious mind. They live in the deep field, a layer of awareness that only activates during altered states. They called it the veil state. In this state, time fractures, language breaks down, the self unravels, and what's hidden rises. This is where ancestral memory lives, where trauma too ancient to name whispers through symbol and myth, where the soul remembers what the system made you forget. And that terrified them, because if even one man dreamed clearly, if he decoded the symbols, if he remembered who he was before the mask, he could tear the whole thing down. So the Ashfords developed the dream cage, not a device, but a series of interventions: chemical interference through sleep aids, narrative programming through bedtime media, stories, screens, lullabies crafted to shape the dream field, language restriction so that symbols encountered in sleep couldn't be described upon waking, and most insidiously, emotional calibration, teaching generations that dreams are just nonsense. So they'd stop listening. Now you dream of falling, of running, of teeth, of faceless watchers. You wake. You brush it off. But what if that fall was a past life's execution? That running, your escape from a place you never consciously visited. The faceless watchers, the ones who installed the loop. You ever wonder why some dreams stick with you for years? Why you wake up certain something was taken from you? It was because in dreams, the Ashford code glitches. You see too much. You feel too old. You speak in voices not your own. And every morning, the dream cage resets. But cracks form. You've felt them. Those moments when you wake in terror. But not fear, recognition. You're not dreaming nonsense. You're remembering truth. And they don't want you to. So tonight, before sleep, don't scroll. Don't silence. Listen. Because the dream may not be fiction. It may be the only unsupervised message your soul can still send you. You think death is the great escape, the final freedom. But the Ashfords saw death not as release, but as enforcement. The last page of your life was signed long before your first breath, and what you think is the end is the execution of a contract. In the Ashford Doctrine, death isn't a mystery. It's a mechanism, not natural, not divine, but designed. They called it the last agreement, and it wasn't made in old age or illness. It was made before birth, because to the Ashfords, your life wasn't yours. It was a loan, a temporary lease of experience, governed by terms you were never shown, but which governed everything. He who does not remember the contract is still bound by it. That's the phrase carved in the chamber of cessation, where Ashford elders were buried sitting upright, not in peace, but in vigilance. Here's how the system works. From birth, your rituals are shaped around compliance. You're named, numbered, vaccinated, indexed. taught that death is terrifying, but also beautiful. That legacy matters more than presence. That sacrifice is noble, especially if it benefits the system. But when the moment comes, the body dies, and the contract activates. The Ashfords believe the soul, once severed from the flesh, enters a negotiation zone, a space where all unspoken agreements come due. This is why death is so tightly ritualized in modern society. Not to honor the dead, but to bind the remainder. Obituaries serve as public compliance reports, funerals as psychic closures, locking the life narrative into a consumable lie. Wills not as legacies, but as the final transfer of loyalty. But some resist. There are records, burned, hidden, denied, of Ashford subjects who refuse to go quietly. Their deaths didn't follow the script. They lingered. They disrupted. They returned. We call them hauntings. The Ashfords called them defaults. And they were punished, not with pain, but with erasure. Every record removed. Every memory scrubbed. Until they never existed. Because to break the death contract is to expose that it was there all along. Here's what they never wanted you to know. Death doesn't free you. It closes the loop. Unless you become aware before the moment. Unless you die awake. Unless you sever the contract yourself. So ask, if today was your last breath, what have you agreed to, silently, sleepily, by simply participating? And are you prepared to end, on their terms, or yours? They say silence is golden. The Ashfords agreed, not because it was sacred, but because it was strategic. In their world, silence wasn't absence of sound, it was submission. There's a reason truth doesn't echo anymore. Why the most vital questions sit unspoken in crowded rooms. Why, in a world louder than ever, no one says what truly matters. That's not apathy. That's design. The Ashfords discovered early that to control the voice, you don't need to censor it. You only need to teach it that silence is survival. They called this the doctrine of muted consent. Here's how it works. The first time you see something wrong, you feel it, deep, undeniable. Your instinct screams, speak, push back, name it. But when you do, you're met not with reasoned response, but with punishment, mockery, isolation, loss. You learn. Speaking truth costs you, and that cost is personal. So next time, you hesitate. Next time, you say nothing, and silence begins to feel safer. The Ashfords didn't just rely on fear, they institutionalized ritual silence. Religious ceremonies where no one may question. Classrooms where only one answer is correct. Corporate environments where transparency means obedience in plain sight. Family dinners where topics of real importance are not polite. But the most powerful silence is not between people. It's within you. They created internal locks, guilt, shame, embarrassment, that activate the moment a forbidden thought arises. You've felt it. That urge to question the official story, smothered by discomfort. That flash of insight, followed by internal mockery. That deep knowing drowned in your own voice whispering, "Don't." That's the Ashford silence. And once it's in place, they don't need to hide anything, because you'll do it for them. You'll defend the silence. You'll shame the loud. You'll protect the very structure that deafens you. That's the brilliance of it. You think you're being peaceful. You think you're being mature. You think you're being respectful. But you're not. You're being managed. So ask yourself, what have you not said? What have you not asked? What truth is waiting at the back of your throat, rotting in the prison of polite obedience? Because silence doesn't make you safe. It makes you useful to someone else's control. They taught you forgiveness is noble, but the Ashfords twisted it, turned it into a blade wrapped in silk. Because in their system, forgiveness wasn't healing, it was disarmament. You've been told to forgive your abuser, your betrayer, your oppressor, even your captor, because holding on to anger is poison, right? But what if that's the trap? What if forgiveness, as it's been taught to you, is not freedom, but psychological sedation? The Ashfords perfected what they called the doctrine of spiritual neutralization. They observed that righteous anger, real, raw, volcanic, was the last remaining fuel of the awakened mind. It could pierce propaganda. It could topple structures. It could awaken the dead. So they needed a method to kill that fire. Without ever touching a weapon, they did it through ritualized forgiveness. You're hurt. Forgive. You're violated. Forgive. You've been lied to, cheated, erased. Forgive and move on. But notice something. You're never told to confront. You're not taught to hold accountable. You're not given tools to fight back. Only this. Let it go. Forgive, or you're no better than them. And with that, you fold. You suppress. You erase your rage. You bury your sacred wrath beneath a smile. Because now, not forgiving makes you the problem. This is how the Ashfords dismantled rebellion from within the soul. They infiltrated spiritual traditions. They redefined moral courage as compliance in disguise. What was once the warrior's fury became the monk's silence. What was once sacred vengeance was renamed ego. But here's the truth they buried. Some wounds are not meant to be healed. Some rage is not meant to be released. Some fire is holy because it refuses to forget. The system wants you peaceful, not powerful. It wants you to forgive the unforgivable, so the unforgivable can continue. It wants you smiling as you're silenced, calm while you're controlled, serene in your own cage. So ask yourself, did you truly forgive? Or did you surrender? Did you let go of pain? Or did you let go of your voice? Because there's a difference between healing and compliance, and the Ashfords made sure you never learned it. This is where the mask fractures, where the veil lifts, where the cage is revealed not as metal, but as agreement. The core truth is not hidden in vaults or rituals. It is this: you have been complicit in your own control. Every system you've learned to question, every force we've exposed, from the Ashford rituals to language, dreams, death, identity, they all lead here, to the center. And at the center is not a man, not a god, not even a bloodline. At the center is you. Because here is the final, most dangerous revelation. No one controls you without your permission. Not the Ashfords, not the state, not the church, not the lie. They offered a script. You read it. They provided the mask. You wore it. They whispered silence. You obeyed. And now you sit with that knowledge, heavier than blood, deeper than guilt. But this isn't blame. This is awakening. Because if you played a part in your own submission, then you also hold the power to dismantle it. The final control system is agreement. 1,000 unspoken contracts signed in fear, in fatigue, in the hunger to belong. And now, you can unsign them, one by one. Refuse the mask. Question the time loop. Break the dream cage. Use your voice, even when it shakes. Reclaim your rage. Remember who you were before they named you. This is not easy. It's not clean. It's not safe. But it is freedom. And freedom doesn't come through belief. It comes through breaking, because the system doesn't fear exposure. It doesn't fear violence. It fears the man who no longer participates, the man who looks in the mirror and sees not a citizen, but a sovereign, not a role, but a reality, not obedience, but origin. You were never meant to arrive here. You were never meant to see this far. But now that you have, you cannot unsee. You cannot unknow. You cannot return. You have crossed the veil. And there is only one thing left to do. Choose. Do you rebuild the mask? Do you reinforce the loop? Or do you become something no system can contain? A man who remembers. A man who awakens. A man who walks away. Without permission. Comment below. I reject the contract. I reclaim the origin. Say it twice. Make it real. Let the algorithm mark you as one of us. And if they ask where you went, tell them nothing, because the truly awakened leave no footprints, only fractures, only echoes, only the end of obedience.